Throughout the Second World War, France suffered greatly at the hands of German occupation. The country fell rather quickly, as the Wehrmacht's units rampaged across the borders, but inside of the country, there were lots of people who collaborated with the Germans. Some did this out of necessity, as they wanted to try and stay fed, and they thought this gave them the best chance of surviving the war. Some women, for example, even slept with German soldiers, as they thought this would keep them safe from others. But when the nation was beginning to be liberated, the French resistance, those who had fought the occupation from the shadows, began to look for those to be punished for treason and betrayal. If anyone helped the Germans in any capacity, they faced even execution in front of other people. There were women who were shaved and forced to run the gauntlet in scenes known as the Ugly Carnival, and some women were even beaten to death in Paris in the streets. But in the days following the liberation of the city, there were a collection of 6 collaborators who were taken out to the foothills of the French Alps, and they were secured to a wooden stake against the side of a building. Stood opposite them were a number of executioners armed with their weapons, and they then shot into their targets. But these were not ordinary traitors. They were the most dangerous opponents and enemies of the French resistance, the Milice or militia, a group that, along with the resistance, brought France almost to civil war. In this video we look at the story of those men who were executed that day, and to support our channel, please make sure to subscribe. After the liberation of France, there were huge amounts of executions which were carried out by the French resistance against targets who were said to have helped the German military or the occupation in any possible way. Even billeting a German soldier inside of a home was enough for someone to be locked up in prison and beaten. There were also people who were involved in black market trade who were said to have been profiteering off the suffering imposed by the Germans, and these people were also punished. The resistance carried out what was known as a wild purge, and instead of bringing many people to courtrooms to face official proceedings, they carried out rash and rough justice, using execution as the punishment, with the judge being a firing squad. The provisional government of the French Republic was set up later, bringing order and trying many of the collaborators, and this included senior members of the Vichy regime and government, such as Marshal Philippe Pétain and Prime Minister Pierre Laval. But one of the biggest threats to the French resistance throughout World War II was their fearsome enemy known as the Milice or the militia. This was a political paramilitary group and force established by the collaborationist Vichy regime and overseen by Prime Minister Pierre Laval. They were French people who were fighting against the forces who were trying to liberate the nation, and they collaborated with groups such as the Gestapo and the SS. Their chief of operations and de facto leader was Joseph Darnand. The milice was made up of members of the French far-right political groups, and many had also joined the group, as their family and loved ones had been killed by Allied bombing raids, and they sought vengeance. Others also had been attacked by the resistance, and they wanted to fight them. So to incentivise the milice, the leaders offered men better and regular pay, increased food rations, employment, and this attracted around 30,000 people to fight the resistance. They were also noticeable by their uniforms, which were blue, and they also wore a noticeable beret on their heads. The milice themselves were known for also being ruthless. They carried out executions and assassinations against French resistance targets, and they also arrested those who were hiding from Nazi persecution. They passed these people onto the SD or Gestapo, and these victims were then sent to concentration camps, where they were then killed. This sort of collaboration was seen as the worst of the worst, and it led to the suffering of so many innocent people. Even children were sent to those camps when the milice rounded up their families. They were also known to have been rough torturers, and they were to the resistance incredibly dangerous, as they had expert knowledge of the local area, including the mountains where the resistance groups were living. As France was liberated bit by bit following D-Day, the French resistance, who were working with the Allies, sought to put their enemies to the sword, and their number one target were members of the Milice. On the 2nd of September 1944, they carried out a number of public executions against members of the Milice, who they had arrested and also captured. These executions occurred inside the settlement of Grenoble, close to the French Alps, and the soldiers of the resistance had gathered members of the Milice together, and there were 6 of them. These men had worked as the local police for the Vichy regime, and the executions of them were to be completely public, and they were to be carried out in front of a large brick factory where previously there had been 23 members of the resistance who had been shot by the Germans. For the resistance, this was more than just vengeance. Inside of Grenoble, a large crowd had gathered, and one witness claimed about the proceedings that it was like they were rushing to watch a circus, laughing and greeting loudly, and rushing to surround the execution site. At the site, people pushed past each other to find a good view. There was a huge amount of anger inside of France, and those who had lived under occupation for years and suffered greatly wanted to see the German collaborators brought to justice in front of their own eyes. The 6 men of the Milice who were condemned were brought out to wooden execution posts outside the factory, and they were tied to a stake by officers of the resistance, and they were tied around their arms and legs so they could not move at all. One witness claimed of the executions that the 6 dying men walked straight to the execution post without any begging or resistance. They turned around, leaned against the post, and obediently let Maquis tie them up. The youngest prisoner was only 19 years old, and the oldest was only 26 years old. The 2 youngest were tied to the posts at both ends. They were by no means heroes. They had opposed France, and some of them were still firing back on the day of liberation. But no one denied that they would also face death. They did not kneel, sigh, or avoid the muzzles of the firing squad. A number of the men who were executed that day were very young. Many may have even been teenagers. It was said of one of the condemned men that I paid special attention to the 19-year-old boy. He was looking up to the sky, just above the firing squad. However, he never would feel the rain again, nor would he see the beautiful Alps above the town. He stood there until the firing squad suddenly opened fire without any signal. The bullets seemed to have entered his chest and heart, but I'm not sure. The shooting was carried out twice. The boy leaned forward and fell back against a pillar, never to look up at the sky again. The firing squad got close to their targets, and they were just a matter of metres away from the 6 men who were tied to the stake. Another witness claimed of the events that, at that moment, the 5 bodies to the north of me fell down slowly, in a terrifyingly neat pattern. The other boy was still standing there. He seemed to be tied tightly to the pillar. His back was straight, but his head was nodding towards the executioner in front of him. The men had all been shot by 2 bullets, but there was more to come. An officer would approach the bodies to offer a final coup de grace gunshot to the head, and it was said of this finishing blow that the moment after the execution seemed to be frozen in time. Then Maquis officers strode to the execution post and shot each of the prisoner in the head with a pistol. At that time the boy closest to me almost fell to the ground, his hands, which were not untied, hanging on the post without touching the ground. The next 4 fell under the post. The boy farthest away also began to slide down slowly. A minute after the officer's inspection, the prisoner's bodies became cold, and his hands were finally untied from the post. People lifted 6 flat coffins from a truck, which looked like they were made of pine wood. After this, the coffins were carried throughout the streets. The executions that occurred that day inside of Grenoble showed the brutality that the French resistance used to put down their enemies and those who they deemed were collaborators of the German army. They wanted to punish, and that day they certainly did this in front of a huge crowd. Thanks for watching. To support our channel, please make sure to subscribe, and once again, thank you so much for watching.